Good afternoon, everybody. Rick Manning here. You know, scientific fraud is on the rise, and it's really hard to put this into really clinical terms because, quite honestly, the scientists are the ones who have to do that. But what we know is, and I'm going to just show you an article from The Guardian that was published last evening. Guardian, not a conservative publication. There's far more scientific fraud than anyone wants to admit. Why should you care about this? And I'll get into a few details, but a lot of our regulations in this country are based upon scientific findings which are dependent upon funds that are provided by the federal government to reach certain conclusions. And when those scientific findings are not then validated or not able to be reproduced or replicated, it becomes we're essentially we're saying, well, we trust somebody who's produced that, who had a financial incentive to come up with the right answer. Well, we don't like it when tobacco companies come and say smoking is cool. But truth be told, we also don't like it when government finances studies with people saying, oh, well, I found all these interesting things, and it turns out none of it's true, because they're stealing our money, A, but B, you can't base policies that are supposed to be based on science that isn't replicable. One of the things, this is just kind of astonishing, and it really was brought to my attention because I was looking at Stanford University, which has all sorts of problems right now. Pac-12 dissolves. They have, their president of the university has to resign because he engaged in scientific fraud. Just little things for a university that's normally ranked as one of the top 3 universities in the nation. But now so they've got some problems, and they've got one of their problems. This guy at the top had his work was found. An independent review of Tessier-Lavig's work found no evidence that he falsified data himself, but concluded that his research failed standards of scientific rigor and process, and he failed to correct the record on multiple occasions. Okay, so essentially, his science was wrong, his conclusions were wrong, and then he refused to correct the record about his conclusions after it was found that they were wrong. Scholar at Harvard Business School was accused of having falsified research about honesty. He did a paper on honesty, and then it turns out he falsified research on honesty. It's kind of seems like a kind of an interesting one. The challenges here are very simple. We've had over nearly 5,500 retractions cataloged in 2022. 30 years ago, there were 20 years ago, there were 40 retractions in 2000. We're either seeing an expansion in the number of fraudulent filings on studies and on science, or we're seeing an increased scrutiny of science. And I hope it's just increased scrutiny. But the fact of the matter is, we're seeing a plague of scientific studies that have been used to do things like determine treatment protocols for patients where the conclusions turn out to be the exact opposite of what the actual study showed. And with life-threatening circumstances for people who've been treated with relatively common maladies. So we've got this crisis of reproducibility. Crisis of reproducibility means one of the bases of the scientific method is that somebody else should be able to take the same data, same methodology of discovering what's true, and come up with the same answer as the person who initially conducted the study. That's kind of how you know that it's actually science, and as a hypothesis becomes a law, because you could do the study, I could do the study, everybody can do the study, and it's going to work every time. Now we know, for instance, if you want to boil water and you're at sea level, and you know that if you get the water up to a temperature of 212 degrees Fahrenheit or 100 degrees centigrade, the water is going to boil. It happens every time at sea level. That is making sure the salt content of the water is the same and the like. So that's reproducibility. And yet, this is what the government aspect of this is. Joe Biden, one of the first acts they did in the Biden administration was to go to a judge and vacate a regulation that the EPA put out, which required reproducibility, required transparency. So imagine the idea that the EPA, which wants to do all these crazy things on climate change and everything else, but they don't want the scientists who they're paying millions and millions and millions of dollars to have to publish how they actually got to their conclusions. So somebody else can go and say, well, I'm going to try that out and see if it's actually true. Because you can't see if you can't. The way you actually dispute science and scientific findings is by saying, I'm going to find out, I'm going to do my own study. I'm going to go and I'm going to take what Joe did, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. And do I get the exact same result? And if you don't, then the conclusions of Joe's study then are up in the air. Because if two people doing the same thing don't get the same result, then there's other variables, and it doesn't work as being a study that can be used to prove anything. So that's science. That's the science that you and I grew up with. It's the science that we all were taught. And yet the EPA does not want to force their researchers to provide transparency on how they came up with their conclusions. I don't know how you then justify anything that the EPA comes up with if the science is based on if an independent researcher can't do the same and can't reproduce it. And yet that's a battle that was fought throughout the Trump administration to try to get reproducibility in the EPA and the science that the EPA was relying upon. Because no place is more dependent upon scientific inquiry than the EPA. Because a lot of the stuff on climate and the like, and all the environmental issues, they're based on projections. They're based on theories of what should happen in the future. And if you can't go and take the data and say, here's how you came up with it, know exactly how somebody came up with it, then you can't build a public policy regime around it. And yet that's what we found it happened. And the fact is, it's indicative that one of the first acts of the Biden administration EPA was to go to court. And in fact, it was within 13 days of them taking over, actually less than that, 10 days of them taking over, that they did a supplemental rulemaking that basically eliminated the original rule. And so that's what we look at. We look at, can you reproduce something or not? I know that this can seem kind of boring, but it's essential to public policy. Let me just go through one little thing I found interesting. And I did something preparing for this. I think you're going to be interested. Let's talk polar bears. And I'm not an expert on polar bears. I stood next to a stuffed polar bear at Anchorage Airport. That's as close as I've ever gotten to one. But the fact is, and I don't think I really want to get that close to a polar bear anyway. But here's one of the things that I think is interesting. Polar bear populations. These are the population estimates and the sources are given. New York Times, covebear.com, International Bear Association, International Wildlife, IUCN, which is a liberal organization, Polar Bear Study Group. Okay, so those are the sources. Polar bear population estimates. In 1950s, how many polar bears do we have? Well, in 1950s, we had 5,000 polar bears that could be identified worldwide. 1965 to 70, 8,000 to 10,000. 1984, between 70 and 84, there was a ban on polar bear hunting. And so the population increased. In 1984, the population 25,000 was the estimate. 2005, 20,000 to 25,000. 2000, and during the George W. Bush administration, polar bears were put on the threatened list on the Endangered Species Act. And so so you have the polar bears now on the threatened list, and yet the population was roughly the same as in 1984. The reason they put it on the threatened list was because of the theory that declining sea ice would create fewer breeding opportunities and the like, and fewer food opportunities for polar bears. So that's why it was put on. You would think that there would be, on the threatened list, with polar bears on the threat list, you would have researchers assiduously counting polar bears every year to track the polar bear population. But, of course, finding, who knows if that actually occurred. I couldn't find any evidence that it was occurred. But here what we have: 2015, an estimate 22,000 to 31,000 polar bears on the scene. No different, if anything, an increase in the number of polar bears. So, and yet we're being told repeatedly by various internet sources and so-called experts that that polar bears are on the dramatic decline, and they have really interesting attacks. Bioscience magazine had an article that they published in 2017. Internet blogs, polar bears, and climate change denial by proxy. And I'm just going to read you this abstract because it tells it all you need to know. Increasingly, surface temperatures, Arctic sea ice loss, and other evidence of anthropogenic, that means man-made, global warming, are acknowledged by every major scientific organization in the world. Well, that's kind of a hyperbolic. I'm confident that I guess if you determine that they don't agree with you, they're not major, then I guess it matters. But however, there's a wide gap between this broad scientific consensus and public opinion. Internet blogs have strongly contributed to this consensus gap by fomenting misunderstandings of AGW causes and consequences. Polar bears, Ursus maritimus, have become a poster species for anthropogenic global warming, making them a target for those denying AGW. So, first of all, why have polar bears become a poster species? Because you can get nice, cute pictures of these majestic white animals with their little baby cubs, and it's so cute. And and Coca-Cola has a polar bear drinking Cokes in their commercials in the past, and and Santa Claus sleighs around with some polar bears and Christmas, and so we have all that kind of mythology around polar bears. And polar bears are a fine species; they're apex species. They are major. They are among God's creations, and they are fierce, and they eat a lot. But so let's just go forward. Here, focusing on Arctic sea ice and polar bears, we show that blogs that deny or downplay AGW disregard the overwhelming scientific evidence of Arctic sea ice loss and polar bear vulnerability. By denying the impacts of AGW on polar bears, bloggers aim to cast doubt on other established ecological consequences of AGW, aggravating the consensus gap. Okay, now we've got a consensus gap. Okay, hold on. I guess the consensus gap is between their scientific consensus and public opinion, meaning the scientists are complaining in this abstract that they're not winning the argument, and so they're complaining that they're not winning the argument. And part of the reason they're complaining that they're not winning the argument is because polar bear populations aren't declining. But let's not let those facts get in the way. Now, when you sit there and you say that, there's all sorts of articles that say polar bear populations are declining, and then they'll give some specific populations where they are. But the fact of the matter is, when you try to find aggregate numbers, the aggregate numbers you get, they always end up admitting that, gee, we could have as many as 30,000 polar bears right now. And they admit they don't count them very well in Russia. And they admit that, so they look at specific populations of polar bears and say, this one's declining, that one's growing. And you sit there and you kind of, count them all. So the professional polar bear counters are up in arms because the polar bears are doing better than they're supposed to. Anyway, this is an interesting article, and if you want to look at Bioscience Magazine, internet blogs, polar bears and climate change denial by proxy, you can read the scientists being all upset about people who say, "Hey, wait a second, maybe you're overstating the effect of climate on polar bears." Another site, there's a ton of them, but Volo Foundation, which is one of the green polar bear sites, you've got polar bear numbers are increasing. That's a myth. But I'll just read you what it says. Climate change is the biggest threat facing polar bears. According to a study conducted by the National Snow and Ice Data Center, over the past 30 years, the Arctic has warmed at roughly twice the rate of the entire globe. Scientists agree that this rapid warming, scientists agree that this rapid warming is a signal of human-caused climate change. The loss of sea ice is making it increasingly more difficult for female polar bears to get onto land in late autumn to build their den for the arrival of their cubs. As sea ice continues to disappear due to warming temperatures, polar bears are struggling to find the food they need to survive. And here's the poor polar bear who's all bummed out because apparently she can't find a den to have her kids. And then this is an advocacy site because then, but you can do something about it. I guess you're supposed to recycle plastic. But this is the kind of stuff you find, and I've read 15 of these kind of sites doing the research on this. But at some point you stumble across the State of the Polar Bear report 2020, which is actually referenced in this study. So, and by Susan J. Crockford. Well, Susan J. Crockford gets attacked in the aforementioned bioscience blog study because they referenced her report, but my goodness, she hasn't actually sat out and counted polar bears herself. She's actually poured through the data on what actually is going on with polar bears, and that disqualifies her. She only looked at she's only looking at the data, and so you got cute pictures of polar bears, the obligatory cute pictures of polar bears. So what's the population size? That would be page 2. And Crockford is got all sorts of credentials related to and academic credentials that are listed. But you have what is the actual? Let's just find the actual. I'm going to go to the executive summary. That's easier. Okay, results of 3 new polar bear surveys were published in 2020. All 3 populations were found to be either stable or increasing. Point 1. And then it goes and talks about some specifics. At present, the official IUCN Red List global population estimate, that's the actual gold standard listing, completed in 2015 is 22,000 to 31,000 average about 26,000. But surveys conducted since then, including those made public in 2020, would raise that average to almost 30,000. There has been no sustained statistically significant decline in any subpopulation. Okay, now this is a conclusion that she came to in looking at the data. That's why you need data actually published. Reports on, so then she just goes through and contrary to, here, this is the other piece I wanted to mention. Contrary to expectations, the new studies found that females in the Svalbard area of the Barents Sea were in better condition, i.e. fatter in 2015 than they had been in the 1990s and early 2000s, despite contending with the greatest decline in sea ice habitat of all Arctic regions. So without going too much into polar bears and the like, the bottom line is there's a reason why you want to force people to publish their data, publish their findings. So really smart people can read it and can tell us, are their conclusions accurate? Are their conclusions accurate? And we can have a discussion, we can disagree on what the right policy for polar bear preservation is, but you really have a hard time having a policy if you don't know how many polar bears there are. And you have a really hard time if you're looking at should the polar bear remain on the threatened list, beyond cuteness, should it be on the threatened list, the threatened species list? Well, it either should or it shouldn't. But if you've got an increasing, to do that though, you have to come up with an answer. And that is, what's the right amount of polar bears on Earth? Because if you're at the right amount of polar bears, at 25 to 30,000 polar bears, if that's what the ecology will sustain, then there's no reason to continue to have the polar bear on the threatened list. None. And it's time we start taking a look at some of these animals that have been put on these lists for political purposes, because they're really cute on a brochure to raise money for an environmental group, and see if they actually are threatened, or is there mythology about it that's keeping them on the list for fundraising purposes? I don't know what the answer is. I'm not a scientist. What I do know is we need to have the ability for scientists to be able to replicate and reproduce the conclusions of others. And when you don't have that, when you don't have a capacity for Susan J. Crockford to go through and actually go through the volumes of data to try to determine what the heck's happening with polar bears, when you don't have that, you don't get to truth. Now, the left will argue, and they may be right, that the polar bear population is in grave danger and they're going to be virtually extinct by 2100 if we don't destroy our economy. That might be a choice. They might be correct, but they might not be. And the fact of the matter is, that's a discussion we should be having in America. And at a time when Joe Biden has stumbled out and said he had declared a climate emergency a couple of days ago, then had to walk it back. At a time when the World Economic Forum is demanding that a climate emergency be declared worldwide, with all the powers that you saw in COVID being exercised against our actual economy, when those kind of things are being talked about actively, when environmentalists are pushing the U.S. federal government to declare a climate emergency, once again, with all of the implications of the destruction of the U.S. economy that it would entail. Well, when you have that, you damn well better be operating on facts. And when those same people tell me that they don't want to reproduce, allow somebody else to independently reproduce their findings and test what their science is, when they say they don't want that, when they specifically rescind that regulation within 13 days of their administration, sorry, folks, I do trust the science. I just don't trust political science. This is Rick Manning. I'm going to just take a look at the old comments here and see where we get going. I got to go to there. Boom. I'm going to go to the top. Now, if you're interested, go ahead and subscribe to what we're doing. There's an easy way to subscribe to get exclusive benefits from Americans for Limited Government and on these videos and stuff. So please take a look at that, and it would be a great honor to us if you were to subscribe. I want to just remind you, I'm not a scientist. I just try, but what we have to do in politics is interpret what's true and what's not true to determine what policy should be. Banging it against philosophy and what the government should be doing. And when you can't trust the data that's being provided, we're in a position where you're basically merely going on, gee, it sort of feels right. And it sort of feels right is a really bad reason to destroy the U.S. economy and to fundamentally transform the world economy, as as a former head of the UN's Climate Change Commission declared was the goal of the Climate Change Commission, and I think it was in 2020. So anyway, yeah, Monica, I was just talking about that. It's he said the other day that he declared a climate emergency and got some pushback. Ironically, not pushback on, gee, that's crazy, but pushback and say, no, you didn't, because he didn't know what he'd done and what he hadn't done. But what that tells me is this is an active discussion within the White House, and we have to be talking about it. And if they want to declare, as they talk about a climate emergency, we damn well better be able to say, and we can, well, can we take a look at your science? Can we reproduce the science? And the answer to that question is no, because they rescinded the regulation. But secondly, places like the LA Times and various media outlets won't allow you to have this discussion. They won't allow you to have this discussion because of the exact abstract I read to you. And that abstract says something very simple. It said, we don't trust people to have access to facts and be able to debate them, because when we have a debate on the facts, we lose. That's what the scientists are crying about. That's why the federal government's done the misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation attack, because ultimately the political science they're offering doesn't jive with what's happening in what people are experiencing in their real life. And so they reject it. And, after the last few years, science has to prove itself again, that it's actually legit. And it would seem logical if the scientific community cared about the legitimacy of what they're putting out, they would embrace the idea of every study being reproducible. And if there were circumstances that made it so it was hard to reproduce, laying out what those circumstances were. But given that they came out, in droves against the reproducibility standard and transparency standard that the Trump administration spent 4 years developing. The fact they came out in droves against it tells me that the so-called scientific community is not interested in science. They're interested in government grants. Paul, thank you for hanging in there. It is important. And one of the things about this, I knew this wasn't going to be a huge topic of conversation. Scientific reproducibility and the scientific method is, most of us fell asleep when they were talking about that in class, but it's important. I just thought it was important to spend some time talking about it, because when you have science, when you have scientific fraud so prevalent and becoming a headline in the Guardian, and you have prominent people, the president of Stanford losing his job, having to resign because the methodology in some of his studies was faulty, and then he wouldn't own up to the fact that his conclusions might not have been accurate or weren't accurate. That takes away, we have to depend on this stuff being honest. And it's a big deal. And so much of our government policies are based upon science that we just have to do that. So Paul, thank you for that encouragement. And I learned something. I didn't know if people could tell how many people are on or not, because one of the things I've done is I always have my screen that would tell that over on a different screen. And as a result, I'm just talking into the camera and I'm kind of oblivious to what's going on. I guess that's not good to admit. I'm so upset we have an incompetent, compromised man playing president. Why hasn't Congress impeached Biden? Okay, well, go to getliberty.org and click on the button and that says impeach Biden, and you can sign on to that and share it. He is just, I believe you are exactly right, Lisa. Once again, go to anybody who's interested in signing it, the newly released impeach Biden's, contact Congress to impeach Biden. Go to getliberty.org, getliberty.org, and right on the front page there's a button that says impeach Biden. Click on that, and you will be able to communicate that sentiment directly to your one congressman and two senators. This for the Trump family. Democrats would have them indicted already, or at least, well, I mean, if it were the Trump family, they wouldn't last a week. I mean, think about this, and obviously this isn't reproducible science, but it's what you want to talk about, so that's what we'll talk about. If this were the Trump family, think about this with Donald Trump. I'm just going to make a broad statement. Donald Trump is the most investigated person in the history of America. Okay, they got his international bank records. They got his own attorney, his personal attorney, to flip on him and tell him all the secrets. They got all the attorney files, so they broke his attorney-client privilege. They had all, obviously all the bank records. They have, and they've spent at least they spied on his campaign. They've been spying. They spied on Trump Tower. They have the surveillance state has turned the world upside down, attempting to show that Donald Trump has done something wrong. And here's what they have. Here's what they've come up with. They came up with, he asked the president of Ukraine whether or not to try to take a look into the corruption in Ukraine. Well, as we now know, that corruption was pretty deep, and Joe Biden was neck deep in it. Donald Trump got impeached for that. Joe Biden denied it and got to be president. Seems right. We have, he ended up, what else did we find out about it? We found out that Donald Trump got up and he encouraged people to do this. I guess is really shocking. He encouraged them to pursue every legal means in an attempt to determine whether or not the 2020 election was stolen. And he encouraged Congress to pursue their prerogative under the law to delay the certification of the votes, so more time would be available to determine whether the votes had been legitimately given to Joe Biden, the Electoral College votes. That's what he's going to be tried on in DC. No, you can't. You can run an election, but no, you're not allowed to actually take any actions that would discredit the election when by actually following your legal, constitutional, and moral responsibility to try to ensure that the proper results were in fact certified. Paul, climate change has always affected our world. Mankind can be blamed for most of it. However, the human depopulation agenda is our greatest threat. So why don't we focus on that? We all know polar bears are doing just fine. Yeah, Paul, I think I should have started this with Kamala Harris' slip up a couple of weeks ago where she said that we have too many humans, and that's the problem. Explains a lot about the Democrat agenda. Corrupt Biden will call climate and try and lock people down again. We talked about that. I think that's possible. Letitia Mendoza, Paul Humphrey, hey, how are you doing? Can you please send me friend requests if you don't mind friendship? Okay, well, that's up to you. That's up to you. Okay, I'm getting out of that business. Well, now Paul's all mad because he doesn't want to talk about polar bears. I'm going to get out of this. The fact of the matter is, the reason for doing this is we have a scientific reproducibility crisis that's destroying the ability for regulators to make informed decisions about what should be done to meet crises that exist. And that is a real and true problem. And the Trump administration sought to address it. And one of the first things the Biden administration did says, we don't want to show our work. And I never trust anybody who wants to effectively, fundamentally change America, just do it under the guise of science without showing their work and how they got there. So with that, we're going to end the broadcast. Appreciate it. You guys take care, and we will be back tomorrow.